Good evening. My name is Tremaine Kwashipi. I'm with Team Golf, and this is another screencast production. Today we will be discussing real estate. Real estate is really close to me, as I would like to start a business that will involve real estate. So sit back and hopefully you'll learn a lot of things. One of the first things you think about with a small business and real estate is whether you'll have some type of rent or agreement or a lease. When looking at a lease, it's kind of described as more of a concrete way of having an agreement between a small business or business and a landlord. You're going to have a set period of time. Usually it's a year. There's going to be a lot of varied terms, and it's very negotiable. With a rental agreement, it's usually more short term, and usually there's going to be more of a month-to-month type of agreement. But for today's screencast, we will be discussing in detail a lease. So when you're leasing a place, one of the first things you want to do is start to look for suitable locations. In the last screencast production, we talked about location and all of the work that goes into a location. You also want to determine what you can afford. What you can afford really talks to the type of square footage that you're going to be looking at, so you need to take all of that into account. You also want to look at the building, so you want to make a walkthrough, so that way you'll be able to see it. You're going to be able to negotiate terms. Then you want to speak with a lawyer, because you want a lawyer to look over anything when you're working with real estate. That's a word to the wise that I would advise. Upon completion of all of this, you're going to turn in your application, and then you're going to assume the property. Some things that you want to consider with a lease. Well, sorry about that. We're going to go back to the types of commercial leases. So some of them you may have heard of. The one that I'll start with is a percentage lease. With a percentage lease, this is the situation where the landlord is going to share in your fortune, if I will. And the reason I say this is because the lease provides for a fixed amount of rent plus an additional amount that is going to be set by a percentage of your gross receipts or your sales. Next, we look at a step lease. A step lease provides for a set rent increase to take effect at started times. With this, you'll be able to provide the peace of mind knowing that your rental amounts will be for a longer time period, while the landlord some protection against rising costs. A net lease is transfer of all expenses that the landlord is traditionally responsible for. So with a single net lease, the tenant pays rent plus taxes relating to the tenant's portion of the property. Under a double net lease, the tenant also pays for a proportional part of insurance premiums. And then finally, you have a triple net lease, which is favored by larger businesses. The tenant pays for all charges payable under a double net lease, plus maintenance and expenses. A fixed lease is provided for a fixed amount of rent over a fixed rental period. These type of lease usually seem the least threatening for small business owner tenants, since you don't have to obligate yourself today for rent increases in the future. But there is a downside to a fixed lease. If you want to renew the lease when it expires, the landlord may choose to raise the rent sharply, particularly if your business appears to be doing well and will suffer from relocating. So they kind of put you at arm's length. And then the last is gross lease. This is the most traditional type of lease. The tenant pays rent, the landlord pays taxes, insurance, and maintenance expenses relating to the property. Increasingly, gross lease contains escalation clause, which provides for the amount of rent to be adjusted usually each year to offset increased expenses. This is a little bit about types of commercial leases. Some things that you want to consider when you're looking at a lease, you want to be able to make sure that you look at the rent amount. So most time a landlord will calculate the rent based on the square footage of the space. But beware of what footage the landlord uses to calculate the rent. For example, does the footage include the elevators and interior walls? And if possible, you want to be able to negotiate things of this nature. Rent increases, very set forth. You want to make sure that your rent does not increase at times that you're not looking for the increase. You also want to make sure that you have this in writing. The security deposit, you want to make sure that you have terms on it, that you'll be able to get it back upon you leaving. The length of the lease. Some landlords are looking for short-term leases, but a lot of them really want long-term leases. And the thing to negotiate is when you have to renew. You don't want it to be able to go up in cost. You also have improvements for the property. Who's gonna make the improvements? The description of the property. The lease should clearly talk about the description. For instance, the lease should clarify whether it includes bathrooms, common areas, parking facilities, and kitchen areas. You don't want to get a property and then you think you're leasing for a certain parking space and then you don't have it. It also talks about signage. You want to check with local zoning to make sure there's no ordinance against the signs you're going to put up. When you're looking at a use clause, many lease agreements will incorporate this for different type of activities that the tenant can engage on the properties. These clauses are also able to protect the property from damage and limit the liability for the property owner. So they just want to make sure that they're safe. We also look at subletting. That's something that's kind of important. Is if you're able to lease your space out to someone else, and this would be really good when you're talking about like barbershops and salons. And then the compliance with American Disabilities Act. Under this act, if a business is open to the public and has more than 15 employees, the premises must be accessible to people with disabilities. So you always want to make sure that you're looking at different acts that make your place safe and acts accessible to others. So next we're going to look at the pros and cons of buying versus leasing. So obviously a pro is that, when you're paying a mortgage, you're going to be able to own something in the end. With a lease, you won't be able to own it at all. The other thing is when you have equity in a property, the equity is going to go up over time. So if you own a business property, then it's going to go up. The other thing to look at though is that it's going up on the real estate and not the business. And then the last thing, you don't have to have landlord hassles. You'll be in more control, and that is a great feeling. The cons though, you might have to sacrifice on location strength, because obviously a lot of people who rent out their businesses, they probably have bought the better locations. Another thing is you have to move out or away from your current space, giving up a well-established location that is a competing tenant might lease and move. So landlords always try to replace one industry tenant with another. And then lastly, you may have to become a handyman or deal with various ownership issues like heating and ventilation. So that's the other thing that goes with that's a con for buying. But if you are considering buying a commercial property to utilize for your business, these are some simple steps. The first is always contact a commercial realtor. It's very different from residential properties. You want to have an expert with you because they can assume the role of a buying agent for you. The next is you want to search for those properties. You want to discuss your price with the realtor, and that includes all of the fees that come along with it. One thing that you want to also talk about is, are there going to be any fees associated with the property, because sometimes properties have like in residential world you'll hear like the word HOA, and you'll hear the words CAM, which is like common area maintenance charges. So that's something that could be associated with a commercial building. Then you want to decide on the property and have the realtor draft an offer. When you submit this offer, you want to submit it with earnest money. Now, what this earnest money does is it kind of acts as if it plays kind of hardball, if I will. It's telling the person that you're trying to purchase that you are putting down some money as an investment, to say, hey, I'm pretty serious about this. And then you want to have time for inspection, and whatever your inspector finds out, you want to tell that to the seller to see can they fix those issues. Always negotiating to the price is firm and where you feel that you are comfortable. And then you'll draft a final offer. After all is done, as the picture shows, you'll have a sold, keys, and all the paperwork done. So you've had a lot of discussion about leasing, renting, and buying. I hope this helps you out in all of your efforts. Again, this has been a presentation by Team Golf, and this is on real estate.